So you're very welcome to our final webinar of 2023. We do get a lot of questions about questions, so we thought what better way to finish off the year than a webinar about questions. So I thought actually I'd start off with a poll this morning. Those of you who've been to our webinars before, you know we do like an owl poll. So let me launch it there. Sorry, it was launched already. Okay. All right. So interesting responses here. And I'll share the results with you now in just a second. And I'm kind of glad the way this has panned out because you've actually come up with the top response there, which is not knowing the answer. To be honest with you, that is usually the answer that we get when we're working with our clients on our 1 or 2 day programs. It's the biggest challenge. So you'd be delighted. I am going to be dealing with that in a few moments. So just before I move on, very briefly introduce myself. I am Barbara Moynihan. Many of you I've met in person. Some of you I haven't. You may have been on programs with Majella or Aideen or other facilitators. So whether I've met you in person, virtually, or never at all, I do hope that you'll have some nice takeaways from our webinar this morning. We are going to be looking just at 3 key areas in terms of questions. What you can do before going into a session where you know there'll be Q&A, what you can do during, and also what you can do when you get the curveball. In other words, the one that you probably don't know the answer to. Before we get stuck in, we do like to get a bit of chat going. So if you want to pop in the chat, just say hello, how are you doing, if you like to. At times, I will ask you little questions that I might be looking for responses to, so you can pop them in the chat. At times, you might have questions for me. And again, you should see a little Q&A button, probably down at the bottom of your screen, depending on what kind of a device you're in. But you should see the chat. So that's where if I ask you a question, you can answer it or respond to me. And if you have a question for me, then you can just pop it into the Q&A. You will be getting a copy of the slides, a recording, etc. And I'll explain all about that a bit later on. Okay, so let's just get stuck in. What you can do before, one of the things people will often say in the challenge is that they can't prepare for the questions. It's right, you probably can't prepare for every single question, but there are certainly things that you can do to help you to be more prepared so that you don't run into a brick wall during your Q&A. In fact, I don't know if you've ever seen it where sometimes people are very well prepared for the presentation itself, but not so much for the Q&A. And just to share a little story briefly, I remember years ago going to I was working in a company. They were looking at buying a piece of new software, and I was sitting in on the pitch from a big provider, like who would be a household name. You definitely know them, but I'm not going to name and shame. So anyway, they come in, slides were beautiful. The 2 presenters were very, very, very polished. Came to the Q&A, and I reckon what happened to them is what happens to a lot of people, in that they had prepared very well for the presentation, but not thought so much about what they were going to say in the Q&A. So you definitely do not want that happening to you. So let's look at just some of the things that we can do in terms of the preparation for the Q&A. The very first thing you think of is the FAQs. So if it's a presentation you give regularly, you're probably used to the frequently asked questions. Now, sometimes people will say, but I've never given it before. Well, the expected questions, I would slot them in under the FAQs. The ones you really need to think about are the ADQs. And what are they? I hear you asking. The ADQs are the absolutely dreaded questions. You know, the one you're thinking, oh my gosh, if I get that one, I think I'll just, run out of the room. But they're the ones you really need to focus on. so that you don't get caught out. And we'll talk about more about them when we talk about the curveball a little bit later on. With the questions that you've prepared for yourself, also prepare the answers, which is logical. But on top of that, make sure you practice saying the answers out loud, because having them written down and actually verbalizing them are two different things. And sometimes what I'll do is, and those of you who've been on programs with us will know we're great fans of the phone. I'll sometimes actually practice asking myself the question, record myself answering it, and listen back to hear how it has come across. If I'm not happy with it, I'll do it again. Once I'm happy with the answers, I save them, and then I listen to them. Same way I listen to a recording of the presentation, just to help the content to soak into my head. Okay, other things in terms of preparation, anything that you have in your presentation is seeds for a question. So just bear that in mind. Sometimes when you're putting in information, you might look and think, if that goes in, that's going to bring us down a rabbit hole that we really don't need to be going into in this particular meeting. If it's not vital to the meeting, take it out, because you'll avoid that rabbit hole. Other things in terms of seeds in your question, in your presentation, you can be quite strategic. For example, let's say you are recommending a change and you want to share some of the benefits. You might say something like, there are many benefits, but I know we're tight in time today, so I'm just going to share for now the top 3. You've told them there are 3. In the Q&A, you've left a little seed that maybe somebody just might ask you, what are more of the benefits? So seed in the questions, anything that's there or anything that you add to verbally can give rise to questions. Other things that can give rise to possible questions are anything that you've left out. And that's obvious. So you can see here my very exotic chart. So we have the UK, Ireland, Spain, and Italy. We've got the 4 quarters in the year. What are 3? Not there. Now, I know this is a very obvious one. If you were given an update and you left out 1 quarter or one particular area or one particular product or service, you're going to be asked a question on it. So bear in mind, anything that's fairly obviously left out is going to be a fodder for a question. And one more point to cover on the before part, just to say to you, we'll stop and check for any questions you have after each of the 3 sections. So if you have any questions in your mind now about things you can do before, pop a question in the Q&A. The final thing that you can do in terms of before is when you're planning your agenda for your presentation, plan where you'd like the questions to come. You will know your audience really well. You know yourself. There's the kind of people who like to, as soon as you start, they're jumping in with their first question. Now, you know in your heart and your soul, you're going to be answering most of those questions as you go through your content anyway. So if you feel it's better to keep the questions until the end, you could say something like, I'm going to go through the content as per the agenda. Could I ask you to keep the questions till the end? Because I feel I'm going to answer most of your questions as I go through it, and it can just mean we can have more efficient use of your time. So you see how I'm framing it in terms of their time. It's not like, drives me bonkers when you jump in with your questions. You might think that, but you set it up that it's for their advantage, because ultimately it probably is. On the other hand, if you're a person who loves to have the questions as you're going along, flag it. Say, look, stop me whenever you like, and I'll answer any questions that you have so far. Okay, so they're just a whistle-stop tour of some of the things you can do before your presentation to help you to be more impactful in your Q&A. I'm just going to check to see if I have any questions here. I don't. No, that's fine. Moving on. So during the Q&A, and just pop in the chat if you wouldn't mind for me here. I'm curious, do you ever find sometimes when you're answering a question that you maybe waffle or talk a bit more than you actually planned to? So just in the chat, if you pop in yes or no. Do you ever sometimes go off track a little bit? Do you ever talk more than you planned to? So just a quick yes or no in the chat would be fantastic. I'll give you a second for your answers. Okay. Okay. I'm not going to call out any names. Again, no naming and shaming here, but those of you who have responded have said yes. Yes, I feel I do, especially if I'm unprepared for the question. Well, that won't be happening after today because now you know how to prepare. But we will deal with when you don't, when it is that one maybe that you have not had a chance to prepare for. Okay, I'm going to share with you a little structure for responding to questions really crisply and clearly. In the chat, pop in, what is this creature? I'm just asking the questions just to make sure that you're still awake. So what is this creature? No prize for getting it right or no shaming if you get it wrong. It could be a heron, could be, but for the purposes of my acronym or mnemonic, I have it as a stork. So I've just had stork come in. That's what it is, indeed. So stork, S-T-O-R-K. It's the acronym that we use when we're answering questions. So if you haven't got a pen and paper, now might be a good time to run and get one. But like I say, you'll get a copy of the slides anyway. The S stands for stop. The T stands for think. Now, you might be thinking, sure, that's fairly basic, but I don't know about you, but certainly in the olden days, before I'd ever had any presentations or communications training, as soon as a question was asked, I felt I had to jump straight in with the answer so that I'd look knowledgeable. But if you think about it, how can you answer a question impactfully if you haven't stopped and thought? I don't know if you find even socially, if you ask somebody a question, they just jump straight in with the answer, you kind of think, I haven't really thought about the question. So stopping and thinking gives you a chance to think properly before you open your mouth. Another word for it is pausing. So you stop and you think, what do I think? Why do I think that? And how can I substantiate my answer or make my point? So you stop and you think, what do I think? So if they say something, you think, that's rubbish. Why do I think that? Because I know, let's say they're suggesting trying something a bit off the wall in terms of a project. And you're thinking, that's rubbish, never work. How do I know? Because we tried it about 3 years ago and it was an unmitigated disaster. So then we can open our mouth and say, look, a few years ago we tried something similar. So it just gives you a chance to think about what you're going to say. But those 3 little words, what, why, how, are your friend. So you've stopped and you've thought. You've had a chance then to organize in your head what you're going to say. You respond. And then the most difficult part, you keep your mouth shut. Again, I know it sounds really basic, but you start by shutting up and you finish by shutting up. And by actually closing your mouth at the end, it stops you from, actually, let me ask you, pop in the chat. What do people often do after they've answered a question? What do they usually say, or what do they usually ask the questioner? They've answered the question, and then they ask the questioner a question. Okay, let me share with you. Okay, instead of closing their mouth, which is so difficult to do, they answer the question and then they'll say, again in the chat, do you ever hear people saying that? Just put in a Y or an N if you're too tired to type in yes or no. Why do we do that? It's nearly like an automatic response. We answer it, yes, yes, yes. Okay, that's all I'm seeing is yeses. Why are we answering? Why are we asking that question? If we've prepared and we know we've got a good answer, we answer the question with real confidence, and then our voice intimates that now we've finished the answer. The danger with that question is this. You've answered their question, but they're thinking, ooh, they say, does that answer your question? You go, yes, but I've got another question. And then the danger is that person takes over your whole Q&A session. Now, if you answer the question and you look back to the questioner and they're looking a little bit puzzled, you could say something like, do you need more clarification? Would you like a bit more detail? Or sometimes I'll actually say, you're looking confused. They go, no, that's just my face. So try and avoid asking that question. If you are ever using it, just use it really, really sparingly. Okay. So before we move on to the curved ball, question that's come in. Okay, so sometimes it's difficult to get people going with their questions. Okay. All right, so sometimes nobody wants to be the first person to ask the question. So what I generally recommend you do, obviously because you've prepared lots of questions for yourself, when you've opened the floor to questions, you can say, who is the first question? It's not who wants to ask a question. Who is the first question, implying, I really want these questions. If people are slow to get going and there should be questions, you could say, look, a question that I'm often asked is. So if you're not getting questions, just maybe start off by asking yourself a question. Sometimes I might just get them going. Obviously, ask yourself an easy question. Don't be asking yourself an ADQ. Okay, so I'm just going to check if there's any other questions coming in. No, all right. So before I go on to our final area for today, which is dealing with the curved ball, just for those of you who may not be overly familiar with this, these are some of the clients that we work with. And I know some of you are here today and you are very welcome indeed. In terms of the team, we're a small team. There are 3 of us, Majella, Aideen and myself, who deliver the programs. I'm probably doing less and more so of the delivery, more on the back end of things. Debbie looks after everything to do with the finance end of things. And then Sharon, a lot of you would have been in touch with Sharon. She does all the operational end of things. And just to mention to you, Sharon isn't with us full time. So she also has her own business where she has Sharon's tutorials. And so what she does there is she's tutorials that have small businesses to maximize their free Google workspace with lots of tips and tricks. So for any of you using Google, check her out. There is a link. You're going to get a link to our webinar page. On that page, there will be this recording. There will be a copy of the slides. There'll also be other tips and tricks for you around communicating in general. And also the link to Sharon's tutorials will be there for you as well. Okay, our final thing, the curved ball. I don't know if you've ever felt like a rabbit in the headlights. That question comes that really you hadn't even thought of in terms of the ADQ. It's like, oh my gosh, where did that come from? The main thing to remember is you don't let it show. So you try to avoid going, it's a good time to practice your poker face when that question is coming in inside your head. You might be freaking out, but your face just looks like you're stopping and you're thinking. Because remember, that's something you'll always do. Here's the beautiful thing about stopping and thinking all the time for every question. If a tricky one comes and you need to take an extra long pause, no problem. Main thing to remember is you are not Einstein. You don't know everything. Even though you might be in your organization for 5, 10, 20 years, it doesn't matter. You still do not know everything. I've never had a group in a program who put their hand up and said, yeah, I know every single thing about my area of the business. It's okay not to know. And I know from experience, so for example, we were working with, it was one of the IT companies. We were talking to the head of Ireland and the UK. We were running some internal programs as part of succession planning. And the head of Ireland and the UK said, will you just make it clear to them? It's okay to not know the answer to a question. They don't need to make something up or try and fumble around if they don't answer it. I'm okay with that. So just be honest. If you don't know, be honest. Say, I don't know. I'm going to come to some of the things you can say though when you don't know the answer. But I think the worst thing you can do is try and make something up. Here's the other thing. If a question comes and it's not your area of expertise. So, you know, if I go to my GP and I've got a problem with my shoulder, as I did recently, he's going to send me off to a consultant, to a specialist, to somebody who knows. So if it's not your area of expertise, just say it. Particularly in an internal communication, I think it's fair enough just to say, look, that's not my area of expertise. You'd be better off talking to whoever the person is. On an external basis, you might say, look, while that's not my area of expertise, I know who can get that information for you. Let me take your details and I'll get them to contact you within and give a deadline. But, don't start trying to answer something that you really are not in a position to answer. So some of the things you can do if you're in a meeting, there may be somebody else in the room who has the answer. So you might redirect to them. Other thing you can do is go parallel. So what do I mean by that? Let's say, for example, they ask you, maybe you're talking about figures and they ask you a question about, so look, what will this look like in the next 3 years? You might say, look, well, while I can't tell you about the next 3 years, I can tell you for the next year, this is what it will look like. So you're not going completely perpendicular to the answer, but you're giving them something in and around the question that they've asked you, maybe not the specific details. If they do ask you a second time, then I would say, I'll give you one of the answers in a second when you don't have the information. If you want to get some samples of people answering questions on quite often tough questions, RTE Radio 1, 8:20 in the morning, it's usually the main interview. Often it's with politicians and you'll hear how they deal with the questions. One thing you'll sometimes see them doing is they get asked a question and they don't want to answer it, so they go completely perpendicular. The interviewer will ask them a second time, then they'll ask them a third time, and then the interviewer will actually say, well, I've asked you 3 times. You're obviously not going to answer the question. Now, I don't think in a professional context you're going to get away with that, but you can aim to go close to the answer. But if they ask you a second time, I think you'll need to revert to one of the scenarios I'm going to cover in a second. If you just don't have that information with them, you need to say, I'll get back to you, but you give it a deadline. For example, if you're asked about something you think it'll take, you could have it by Thursday, but definitely by Friday. I'd say, look, I don't have that with me, but I'll get that information to you by close of business on Friday. So it's not a problem to not know the answer. It's how confidently you deliver the response that counts. If by Friday you haven't got the information, you check back in with them and let them know, look, I haven't forgotten about you, still working on it, I'll get it for you. So just before we come to the end, some of the phrases that might be useful for you when you're asked one of those curveball balls. And you can say, I've never been asked that before. Particularly if it's true, because if you had been asked it before, well, you know the answer. Could say, honestly, I don't know how I'd answer that. Because if you don't know how you'd answer it, there's no point in making up an answer. So I think it's better, going back to our point of not being Einstein and being honest, I think it's better to admit that you don't know the answer. This final one here, thanking them for raising the question, is it's something I'll definitely take into consideration, or it's definitely something that I'll look into. So that's acknowledging that they've had a question, that you're grateful that they've raised it, and you're going to look into it. But do not say good question. And keep an eye out for people who do use that phrase, good question. Good question will usually come, not always, sometimes it comes when it's that they don't know the answer. So be very careful of grading the question. Now, sometimes the question might be a good question. I'd rather that you said something, I'm glad you've asked that question, or interesting that you've asked that. Because here's the thing, one person asks a question, I go, good question. Somebody asks another question, I go, great question. Third person asks a question and I just answer it. Is their question not good or great? Try and avoid grading the question. But in my experience, the saying good, great question comes in when the person doesn't actually know the answer. So just be mindful of avoiding saying that. So just quick check, any last questions before I wrap it up? No, which is either one of two things. You haven't understood anything, or it's all been incredibly crystal clear for you. Just to finish with those questions, the curveballs, remember, you're not Einstein. It's okay to not know all the answers. Now, if you find you can't answer any of the questions, maybe you need to query your preparation, because maybe you were on a different wavelength, and maybe you need to just call it out. To finish, just to remind you, you're going to get a link definitely before Friday with the webinar page, the slides, the recording. When you log out of this webinar, you'll get a SurveyMonkey. Please do fill it in, because we love to get your feedback. So to finish off, that's what you can do before, during, and the curveball. But let me leave you with a very simple question. If you feel like popping the answer in the chat, please do. Otherwise, you are free to go. And thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you in 2024.